On the morning of the 14th of June, 1867, at 20 minutes past 8 o'clock, the 58-year-old postmistress of Pemaquid village on the central Maine coast, Mrs. Lavinia Endicott, sat at her small, dark oak desk in the one-room wooden post office on the village's main lane, sorting through the morning's incoming mail by the warm amber light of a brass kerosene lamp, and she opened a folded sheet of high-quality pale cream linen paper, sealed with a red wax seal, bearing the crest of the Caldwell family of Beacon Hill, Boston, and she read what it said. And at 25 minutes past 8, she set the letter down on her desk, removed her small, round, wire-rimmed reading spectacles, and sat very still in her wooden chair for the next half-hour, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the small, framed daguerreotype of her late husband on the wall above her desk. At a few minutes past 9 o'clock, she put her spectacles back on. She folded the letter back into its thirds. She drew from beneath the high collar of her dark plum-wool dress the small, thin brass key on the thin black silk cord that she wore around her throat at all times. She unlocked the small mahogany drawer at the lower right of her desk. She placed the folded letter inside the drawer. She closed the drawer. She locked it. She slipped the key back beneath her collar. The letter remained in the locked drawer for the next 36 years. It had been addressed to Mrs. Sarah Halsey of Pemaquid, who was at that hour washing the breakfast dishes in the small kitchen of her cottage at the eastern end of the village lane, with her 4-month-old infant daughter, Hannah, strapped to her chest in a folded length of gray wool, while her 6-year-old son, Eben Jr., swept the front room floor, and her 4-year-old daughter, Susan, sat at the kitchen table, fitting wooden buttons into a small tin cup, and Mrs. Sarah Halsey had not yet been told, and would not, in any of the 55 years of life remaining to her, be told that a letter had come for her from her parents in Boston that morning. To understand what Lavinia Endicott had done at her desk on the morning of the 14th of June, 1867, the listener must first understand who the parties were and what had brought them, separately, to that particular morning at that particular post office on that particular stretch of the Maine coast. Lavinia Endicott had been the postmistress of Pemaquid for 12 years by that June. She had taken the post in the summer of 1855, 2 years after the death of her husband, Captain Thomas Endicott, who had been the master of a small coastal trading schooner out of Pemaquid and who had been lost at sea in a winter gale off the Grand Manan Reefs in the autumn of 1853. The post office had previously been held by Lavinia's father, Mr. Ebenezer Pratt, who had died in the spring of 1855 at the age of 72, and Lavinia had been appointed his successor by the Federal Post Office of Augusta on the strength of her father's recommendation given on his deathbed, and on the strength of Lavinia's own neat copper-plate hand and steady character, which the village had not disputed. She had been 46 at her appointment. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had had no children of her own. She had taken the post and the small one-room wooden post office at the center of the village as her parish, in some quiet sense of the word, and she had done what postmistresses on the New England coast had done for 100 years before her, which was to read every letter that passed through her office before she delivered it. This practice was not, in the year 1867, anything other than the ordinary work of a village postmistress on the coast of Maine. The Federal Post Office did not formally sanction it and did not formally forbid it. Letters in those years were folded and sealed, but not generally placed in envelopes. The sealing was a matter of red wax or a small folded fastener that could be carefully lifted with a thin blade and resealed with reasonable effort. The postmistress read what came through her office because it was the postmistress's business to know who in the village was corresponding with whom, what cargoes were owed, who was ill, who was bereaved, who had married, who had begged for money, and what news was coming in to which household, partly because the postmistress was expected to convey the news of bereavement personally to the family rather than have it learned from a folded sheet in a tin mailbox, and partly because the postmistress was expected to act as the village's first line of compassionate response. Lavinia Endicott had been one of the most discreet practitioners of this old practice on the central Maine coast. She had not, in her 12 years to date in the office, ever broken the confidence of a letter to anyone, not even her sister-in-law Cornelia Vance, who came down to the post office twice a week for tea. She had not, in those 12 years, ever withheld a letter from its addressee. She had read everything. She had delivered everything. She had judged each letter in the small private chamber of her own conscience, and had carried the burden of what she had read in the small private chamber of her own conscience, and had never, in 12 years, found that she could not bear to deliver something. Sarah Halsey had come to Pemaquid in the autumn of 1857, 10 years before that June morning. She had been 17 years old. She had been the only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Josiah Caldwell of 8 Lewisburg Square, Beacon Hill, Boston, a wealthy mercantile family of long standing, and she had eloped from her parents' home on the night of the 18th of September, 1857, in the company of a 27-year-old Pemaquid fisherman named Eben Halsey, whom she had met in the summer of that year while her family had taken a coastal holiday at the Pemaquid Beach Hotel. The Caldwells had cut their daughter off completely upon the marriage. They had returned every subsequent letter from Sarah unopened, with the seal unbroken, with a single phrase, "Refused, return to sender," written across the back of each envelope in Mr. Josiah Caldwell's own hand. There had been 7 such letters between 1857 and 1860, sent by Sarah at intervals of several months. Lavinia Endicott had personally re-received each of the returned letters from the Boston Post Office's monthly packet boat, and had personally delivered each returned letter to Sarah Halsey at the cottage at the eastern end of the village lane, and had watched Sarah weep silently each time, and had said nothing about it to anyone in the village. Sarah Halsey had stopped writing to her parents in 1860. The marriage between Sarah Caldwell and Eben Halsey had been, by every account in the village, a happy one. Eben had been a quiet, kind man of his trade, the 3rd son of a Pemaquid fishing family, with no fortune but a small fishing dory of his own and a half-share in a small coastal sloop, the Mary Ann. He had built Sarah a small cottage at the eastern end of the village lane in the spring of 1858. He had given her 3 children. Eben Halsey Jr. had been born in 1861, Susan in 1863, Hannah on the 14th of February, 1867, 4 months and 3 days before the morning the letter would arrive at the post office. On the morning of the 22nd of March, 1867, 6 weeks after Hannah Halsey's birth, Eben Halsey had sailed out on the Mary Ann with 2 other Pemaquid men for the spring cod run on the Outer Banks south of Monhegan Island. A sudden squall had taken the Mary Ann and all 3 men on the afternoon of the 23rd. Their bodies had washed up on the rocks of Pemaquid Point over the following 4 days. Eben Halsey had been buried on the 2nd of April, 1867, in the small village burying ground above the cove. Sarah Halsey, 27 years old, had been left with 3 children under the age of 7, a small cottage that had been built on borrowed money, the loan on which was held by the village savings bank, no inheritance, and a half-share in a fishing sloop that no longer existed. Eben's family, his elderly mother, his 2 older brothers, had not warmed to Sarah in the 10 years of the marriage. They had considered her a Boston girl and had not, even in private, called her by her Christian name. They had attended Eben's funeral. They had not, in the 11 weeks since the funeral, called at her cottage. They had, on the 6th of June, sent her a brief written notice that the loan on the cottage would be called in by the bank on the 1st of August unless arrangements were made. Sarah Halsey, on the evening of the 6th of June, 1867, had sat at her small plank kitchen table with her 4-month-old daughter Hannah asleep against her chest and her other 2 children asleep in the loft above her head, and she had written in her steady, neat hand the first letter she had written to her parents at 8 Lewisburg Square in 7 years. The letter had said that her husband had died in March, that she had 3 children, that the eldest was 6 and the youngest a nursing infant, that she had no means, that she had no other family to whom to turn, that she did not request that her parents forgive her for what they had not been able to forgive her for in 1857, but that she was writing now for the children's sake and not for her own, and that she was throwing herself on what mercy they might find it in themselves to extend. She had signed the letter Sarah. She had not signed it Halsey or Caldwell. She had carried the letter to the village post office on the morning of the 7th of June and had paid the postage to Boston, and Lavinia Endicott had taken the letter, and Lavinia Endicott had not read it because she had recognized the address and had understood that the contents would be private to a degree she did not wish to know. She had sent the letter on the next Boston-bound packet. She had not told Sarah she had recognized the address. The Caldwell reply had arrived on the morning of the 14th of June, 1867. Before this story goes on, before what Lavinia Endicott did with the Caldwell reply and the 36 years of her keeping of it, the teller must ask the listener something. If you have ever held in your hands a thing that another person had written to a third person, and you have known, in the moment of reading it, that delivering it would do that third person more harm than not delivering it ever could, and you have had to choose, alone in a quiet room, with no one to advise you and no one to share the weight, please tap the like button below. And if you are new to Salt and Lantern, subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the sea. Now the story will go on. The Caldwell reply, dated the 11th of June, 1867, and written in the fine slanted hand of Mrs. Sophia Caldwell at Mr. Josiah Caldwell's dictation, said the following. The Caldwells had received their daughter's letter of the 7th of June. They had read it. They had considered it. They had concluded, after consultation, with the Reverend Doctor of Trinity Church, Boston, who was the Caldwells' minister, that they would receive their daughter Sarah back into the Boston home on the express condition that she relinquish her 3 children to the Boston Children's Aid Society's charitable orphanage upon her arrival in Boston, and that she present herself thereafter in Beacon Hill Society as a widow who had had no issue from her unfortunate marriage, and that the children would be placed by the Aid Society with suitable families who would raise them in respectable circumstances, of which the Caldwells would be kept informed at a distance. They were prepared to provide for Sarah's reception into the home and for a small annual income suitable to her position as a widowed Caldwell daughter, and they were prepared to receive her once and would not, the letter said in its final paragraph, write to her again if these terms were declined. The letter ended with the formal salutation from her father and mother, and with Mrs. Sophia Caldwell's signature, and with the date. Lavinia Endicott had read the letter twice. She had then sat at her desk for the next half hour with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on her late husband's daguerreotype on the wall above the desk. She had understood, in the half hour, 3 things in a slow, ordered clarity. The first was that Sarah Halsey, in her present condition of grief and exhaustion and material desperation, would on receipt of this letter feel herself faced with 2 impossible choices: to give up her 3 children in exchange for survival, or to refuse the terms and to face the public knowledge in the village of Pemaquid that her own family had offered her their assistance and that she had refused it, which would have the effect of hardening the village against her at the very moment when the village was her only remaining means of support. The second was that Sarah Halsey, who was a woman of strong heart and who, in Lavinia Endicott's 12 years of knowing her, had never given any indication of being capable of giving up a child, would certainly refuse the terms, and that the refusal, given Sarah's circumstances, might break her in some way that would not be reparable. The third was that the village of Pemaquid, if the matter were properly handled by Lavinia and by the village minister, Reverend James Foster, was perfectly capable of supporting Sarah Halsey and her 3 children on unconditional terms for as long as it would take Sarah Halsey to build her own way forward by her own hands. Lavinia Endicott had then folded the letter back into its thirds and had locked it in the small mahogany drawer at the lower right of her desk. She had decided that Sarah Halsey would not be told that a letter had come, that the village relief would be organized to appear to have arisen spontaneously, that the matter of the Boston parents would be allowed to remain, in Sarah's mind, the matter of 7 returned letters in 1857 through 1860 and a definitive silence thereafter, and that Lavinia Endicott would carry the existence of the 14th of June letter alone in her locked desk drawer and in her own conscience for as long as Lavinia Endicott lived. She had also decided in those same minutes one further thing. She had decided that she would write a small private account of what she had done that morning and why in her own hand, and that she would place it in the same locked drawer as the letter, and that she would amend the account at intervals throughout the rest of her life, recording her observations on Sarah Halsey's life as it unfolded, so that if ever in some unforeseen future the locked drawer was opened by another postmistress, the reader of the account would have at least the record of Lavinia Endicott's reasons and could judge whether Lavinia Endicott had judged rightly. She wrote the first entry that same afternoon. She wrote in her steady copperplate hand on a small folded sheet of plain paper at her desk in the late afternoon light. She wrote that on the 14th of June, 1867, she had received a letter from Mr. and Mrs. Josiah Caldwell of Beacon Hill, Boston, addressed to their estranged daughter, Sarah Halsey of Pemaquid, and that the contents of the letter had been of such a nature that the postmistress had judged, upon careful consideration, that delivering the letter would cause Mrs. Halsey to be confronted with a choice that no woman of conscience should be required to make at any time, and that no woman in Mrs. Halsey's particular present circumstances of grief and material extremity could reasonably bear, and that the postmistress had elected to withhold the letter. The postmistress had recorded that her decision was made without consultation with any other party, that she accepted the full weight of the decision as her own, and that she would, by way of partial compensation for her exceeding of her ordinary duties, devote her own efforts and her quiet influence in the village to ensuring that Mrs. Halsey received from the village of Pemaquid the unconditional support that her own family had declined to provide. She had signed the entry, Lavinia Endicott, postmistress, Pemaquid. She had folded the account beside the letter in the locked drawer. She had stood up from her desk at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and had walked the half-mile up the village lane to the small, white-painted Methodist chapel at the center of the village, where Reverend James Foster, the village minister, was just finishing the small set of evening tasks at his pulpit before going home to his supper. She had asked Reverend Foster, in her quiet, steady voice, whether he might walk with her back down the lane to the post office, as there was a small matter of conscience she required to discuss with him under the seal of his ministry. Reverend Foster had returned with her. She had unlocked the drawer in his presence. She had handed him the letter. She had asked him, before he opened it, to consider that what she was about to show him would breach the ordinary confidence of his ministry and the ordinary confidence of her post office, and that she would understand entirely if he were unable, given his duty, to proceed any further with her. Reverend Foster had said that he would proceed. He had read the letter. He had set it down on the desk. He had not spoken for several minutes. Then he had told Lavinia Endicott in his slow, careful voice that she had been right to withhold the letter, that he would assist her in establishing the village relief for Mrs. Halsey, and that he himself would carry the same weight she was carrying for as long as he lived. He had served as minister at Pemaquid for 12 more years after that conversation. He died in 1879. He kept the confidence to his death. The village relief for the widow Halsey was organized by Reverend Foster over the course of the next month, presented to the village from the pulpit in his careful manner as a Christian duty arising naturally from the loss of one of the village's young fishermen, and accepted by the village in the careful collective way that small New England villages accepted such initiatives. By the end of July 1867, an unofficial weekly basket of staples was being left at the door of the Halsey cottage by various village families in rotation, on the understanding that no one of these families would ever speak of it directly to Sarah Halsey. By the autumn of 1867, the village savings bank had quietly extended the loan on the Halsey cottage by an additional 12 years on the bank manager's own private guarantee, which Reverend Foster had quietly arranged. By the spring of 1868, Sarah Halsey recovered enough in body from the long winter of grief to begin to look for her own income, had opened a small village laundry in the front room of her cottage, taking in washing and ironing for the village families and for the small Pemaquid beach hotel during the summer season. And the village families had quietly arranged to send her every shirt and every piece of household linen they could justify sending. By the summer of 1872, 5 years after the letter, Sarah Halsey was supporting her 3 children on her own laundry income with the unconditional, quiet help of the village. The village relief baskets having been gradually phased out as her income had risen, and Sarah Halsey had repaid the bank loan on the cottage in full in the autumn of 1872 from her own earnings. There had been one moment of danger in the autumn of 1871, 4 years after the letter. Sarah Halsey had walked down to the village post office on a Saturday morning to post a small parcel of mended shirts to a Bath customer, and Lavinia Endicott had been ill with a heavy cold and had been working through her morning's mail with her spectacles slipping down her nose and a kerchief pressed to her face, and on Lavinia's desk that morning, set out in plain view, because Lavinia had been considering whether to write a fresh entry into her account, had been the folded Caldwell letter, half drawn out of the open mahogany drawer. Sarah Halsey had set her parcel on the small wooden bench against the wall. She had walked up to the desk to pay her postage. She had glanced down at the desk. She had seen, in the corner of her eye, the corner of a folded sheet of cream linen paper with what appeared to be the Caldwell family crest visible in red wax. She had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She had stood very still at the front of the desk, with her gray-green eyes fixed on the corner of the paper. Lavinia Endicott, who had felt the change in Sarah's silence, had moved her left hand carefully across the desk and had drawn the corner of the paper back into the drawer with a small motion she made appear to be the natural straightening of her desk. She had then asked Sarah, in her ordinary, measured voice with the cold in it, what was the weight of the parcel. Sarah had named the weight. Lavinia had calculated the postage. The transaction had been completed in 3 minutes. Sarah Halsey had left the post office. She had walked the half-mile back up the lane to her cottage. She had not raised the matter with Lavinia ever again. She had also never written to her parents in Boston again, and she had never asked Lavinia whether she had heard anything from them, and Lavinia had never spoken of them. Whether Sarah Halsey in that moment in the post office on the autumn morning of 1871 had seen what she had seen and had understood what she had seen and had decided to permit Lavinia Endicott the keeping of whatever it was, Lavinia Endicott did not know. She had written a small note about the moment in her account that evening. The note had read only, "She glanced at the desk this morning and may have seen what is there. If she did, she has elected in her own quiet way not to know. We are perhaps in this together now." The village relief had succeeded. Sarah Halsey never spoke of the Boston letter, whether because she did not know of it or because she had decided that she did not wish to know of it, and Lavinia Endicott did not raise the matter, and the 2 women lived in the village together for the remainder of Lavinia's life, on the unspoken understanding that one of them was keeping something for the other. She lived in the small, gray shingle cottage at the eastern end of the village lane for the rest of her life. She raised her 3 children there. Aben Halsey Jr. became the school teacher at the small Pemaquid village schoolhouse in 1882 at the age of 21, the first college-educated school teacher the village had ever had, having gone through Bowdoin College on a scholarship that Reverend Foster had quietly arranged before his death. Susan Halsey followed her brother into teaching, took her training in Bath, and taught school in Bath, Maine for 41 years, retiring in 1924. Hannah Halsey, the youngest, the 4-month-old infant of the morning the letter arrived, proved the most singular of the 3. She announced at the age of 11, at the kitchen table of the cottage that she intended to become a physician. Her mother had set down her teacup carefully and had asked her how she intended to do that. For her, Hannah had answered, in the same quiet, steady tone Sarah Halsey had used in 1857 when she had told her father at 8 Louisburg Square that she intended to marry Eben Halsey, that she had not yet worked it out, but that she would do it. She did. She worked for 10 years at the Pemaquid Beach Hotel as a chambermaid and laundry assistant, saving every dollar she earned with her mother's help. She enrolled at the Brunswick Medical College in 1888 at the age of 21, having been refused admission 3 times in the preceding 3 years on the grounds that the college had never admitted a woman and was not inclined to begin. The 4th application had been supported by a written letter of recommendation from Dr. Edwin Marsh of the Pemaquid Beach Hotel Infirmary, who had observed Hannah's work as a chambermaid during the summer seasons and had judged her in his letter to be possessed of more native medical intelligence than any of the 8 male graduates the college had sent into Lincoln County in the preceding decade. The college had reluctantly admitted her on probation. She had paid her tuition in cash from her savings, in dollar bills, folded carefully into envelopes, the entire sum of $240 for the first year, having been earned at the laundry and the hotel infirmary over 7 years of work. She had attended classes from 1888 to 1892. She had been required to sit in a separate seat at the end of the back row of every lecture hall. She had been refused entry to 2 of the 4 anatomy laboratories the male students were permitted to use. She had been ignored in the classrooms by 3 of the 7 professors for the entire 4 years of her degree. The other 4 professors had eventually warmed to her. She had graduated in 1892 at the age of 25, the first woman ever to take her medical degree at Brunswick, with the highest examination scores of her graduating class in 3 of the 4 major subject areas. The college had not, in its formal commencement program, acknowledged that she was the first woman to take the degree, an omission which the elderly dean had personally regretted and had attempted in his closing remarks to indirectly remedy. She returned to Pemaquid and was licensed to practice medicine in Lincoln County, Maine, in the autumn of 1892, the first licensed female physician of the county. She founded a small free clinic for the women and children of the central Maine coast in 1894. She married Dr. Edmund Whitfield, a Brunswick classmate, in 1895. She bore no biological children, but she and her husband adopted 2 children, a boy and a girl, in 1898 and 1901. She practiced medicine in Lincoln County for 46 years, retiring in 1938. She died in 1947 at the age of 80. Lavinia Endicott served as the postmistress of Pemaquid until the spring of 1903. She was 94 years old at her retirement. She had served as postmistress for 48 years. She died on the 3rd of June, 1903, in her bed at her small cottage at the south end of the lane, in her sleep, 3 weeks after her retirement. She was buried in the village burying ground above the cove. Her successor in the post office, her niece by marriage Miss Cornelia Vance, 51 years old, and the postmistress in her own right from that summer, had not been able to open the locked mahogany drawer at the lower right of Lavinia's old oak desk on the day after the funeral, because the small brass key on the thin black silk cord was not anywhere in the office or in Lavinia's cottage. Cornelia had concluded, after some inquiry, that the key had been buried with Lavinia. The key had been, by Lavinia's own quiet instruction, in a small, written note left for her solicitor, buried with her around her throat, beneath the high collar of her best dark plum wool dress, with the instruction that the locked drawer should remain locked. Cornelia Vance had not pressed the matter. She had set the desk back at the center of the post office on the morning of her own first day in the post. She had kept the desk and the locked drawer in their places for the next 24 years, without ever opening it. In the spring of 1927, the Federal Post Office of Augusta authorized the installation of a telephone exchange in the Pemaquid post office building, and the renovation of the post office building to accommodate the exchange required the removal of the postmistress's old oak desk to make room for the new switchboard. Cornelia Vance, on the morning of the 11th of April, 1927, summoned a Bath locksmith to open the small mahogany drawer. The locksmith opened the drawer in under a minute. Inside Cornelia Vance found the folded Caldwell letter of June 1867, the seal, long since broken, and a folded packet of small sheets of paper in Lavinia Endicott's hand. The packet of small sheets ran to 18 pages. The first entry was dated the 14th of June, 1867. The last entry was dated the 2nd of May, 1903, 3 weeks before Lavinia's death. The entries recorded, in Lavinia Endicott's steady copper plate hand, every year of Sarah Halsey's life, from 1867 to 1903, in the careful detail of a woman who had been the village's quiet watcher of one family for 36 years. The entries recorded Eben Halsey Jr.'s entry to Bowdoin in 1879. The entries recorded Susan Halsey's first teaching position in Bath in 1885. The entries recorded Hannah Halsey's enrollment in medicine at Brunswick in 1888. The entries recorded the day Sarah Halsey paid off the bank loan on the cottage in 1872, recorded with a single sentence, "She has done it on her own, as she would have done it on her own, had the village done nothing." The entries recorded the day Dr. Hannah Halsey returned to Pemaquid as the licensed physician of Lincoln County in 1892, recorded with the sentence, "Today I knew." The final entry of the 2nd of May, 1903, recorded only, "I have carried this for 36 years. I do not regret it." Cornelia Vance read everything carefully. She closed the packet. She locked the drawer again. She called upon the village minister of 1927, Reverend John Foster, grandson of the original Reverend James Foster, by the small accident of village inheritance, and she walked with him together to the cottage of Eben Halsey Jr. at the eastern end of the village lane, where the 3 Halsey siblings, Eben Jr., now 66 and retired from teaching, Susan, now 64 and visiting from Bath, and Dr. Hannah Halsey Whitfield, now 60 and visiting from her clinic in Damariscotta, had gathered the previous week to mark the 5th anniversary of their mother's death. Cornelia Vance gave the letter and the packet of Lavinia's account to the 3 of them in their mother's old front room. She did not speak as they read. They read together. They did not speak for a long time after they had finished. Then, Eben Halsey Jr., the eldest, sat very still with his hands folded in his lap and said, in his slow, careful schoolteacher's voice, that he was grateful for what the postmistress had done. He said his mother had lived a happy life. He said his mother had built that life with her own hands and with the unconditional help of the village. He said that the Boston life, on the terms the Caldwells had offered, would have unmade her and would have unmade her children. He said the postmistress had judged it rightly. Susan and Hannah agreed. Dr. Hannah Halsey Whitfield, the youngest, the 4-month-old infant of 1867, asked Cornelia Vance whether she might take the letter and the account into her own keeping for safe preservation, and whether the village might consider the placement of a small marble plaque on the wall of the post office in memory of Lavinia Endicott. Cornelia Vance agreed to both. The plaque was placed in the autumn of 1927. It read, "In memory of Lavinia Endicott, postmistress of Pemaquid, 1855 to 1903. She knew when to deliver and when not to." The plaque is still on the wall of the Pemaquid Village Post Office today. Dr. Hannah Halsey Whitfield kept the letter and the 18-page account in a small mahogany box on her writing desk for the rest of her life. She gave both to the Maine Historical Society in 1947, 2 months before her death, with a written letter of provenance explaining the circumstances. The Maine Historical Society holds the letter and the account in its archive in Portland. The Pemaquid Caldwells of 8 Louisburg Square, by the time the story was made public in 1927, had been dead for many years. Mr. Josiah Caldwell had died in 1881. Mrs. Sophia Caldwell had died in 1889. The Caldwell line had failed in the male succession with Mr. Caldwell's death, his other children having predeceased him, and the house at 8 Louisburg Square had been sold to a Boston attorney's family in 1890. The Caldwells were not in any position, by the time of the discovery, to be hurt by the story, nor to defend themselves against it. The story was made public in a small article in the Lincoln County News in November 1927. The article was not picked up by the Boston papers. It was read in the central Maine coastal villages. It was remembered. Thank you for listening to this story from Salt and Lantern. If it has moved you, or if you have ever known what it is to make a small private decision in a quiet room that no one else in the world would ever know about, and to carry the weight of that decision for years afterward in the chamber of your own conscience, please leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the sea. Good night, and may your own light burn steady through whatever storm comes next.